You were not abandoned. You were shown the truth. The suffering did not begin when they stopped choosing you. It began when you refused to see it. Most people do not suffer because they are unloved. They suffer because they cling to what has already let go. The Buddha taught that pain is not caused by loss. It is caused by attachment to what no longer remains. Stay with this teaching until the end, because what you are about to hear may feel uncomfortable at first, but it will quietly set you free. You did not lose them. You lost yourself trying to stay. And the moment you see this clearly, suffering begins to loosen its grip. You lose inner peace long before you realize it. When you remain in a place where you are not chosen, the first thing you lose is not the person, the connection, or the relationship. What you slowly lose is your inner peace, and this loss happens so quietly that most people do not notice it at first. The mind begins to lean outward, constantly scanning for signals, tone, silence, and subtle changes. And in Buddhist understanding, this outward leaning of the mind is the beginning of unrest. Instead of resting in the present moment, awareness becomes restless, always measuring whether you are enough, whether today will be different, whether you will finally be seen. The Buddha taught that peace is the natural state of the mind when it is not grasping. Yet when you stay where you are not chosen, grasping becomes a habit. You start holding on to moments that briefly felt warm, replaying them again and again, hoping they will return, while ignoring the reality unfolding in front of you. This is how peace dissolves, not through dramatic loss, but through continuous tension. As attachment deepens, the mind no longer settles. It waits, it anticipates, it reacts. Even moments of apparent calm are filled with expectation, and expectation is never peaceful because it demands the future behave in a certain way. In Buddhist philosophy, the mind that demands is already suffering. Over time, this constant inner negotiation weakens your capacity to be present. You may still smile, still speak kindly, still show patience, but inside there is a subtle fatigue. The heart grows tired of hoping without clarity, and the mind becomes crowded with unanswered questions. This is not love, and it is not compassion. It is the quiet erosion of peace through attachment. True peace, as the Buddha pointed out, does not need to be earned, chased, or confirmed by another. It arises naturally when the mind releases its grip. The moment you stop waiting to be chosen, the mind begins to rest again, and in that resting, peace returns not as something new, but as something that was never truly lost. You lose your ability to see reality clearly. When you stay where you are not chosen, the mind does not simply lose peace. It begins to lose clarity. In Buddhist teaching, clarity is not a concept, but a state of seeing things as they truly are, without distortion, without hope pulling the mind forward, or fear pushing it backward. Yet attachment quietly clouds this clarity, and the longer you remain, the thicker the fog becomes. At first, the mind tells gentle stories. It explains away absence as busyness, distance as confusion, and silence as something temporary. These stories feel comforting, but Buddhism reminds us that comfort built on illusion always leads to suffering. The mind that clings does not want truth. It wants reassurance, and reassurance is often the enemy of wisdom. As attachment strengthens, perception shifts. You stop responding to what is present and start responding to what you imagine could return. Each small gesture becomes overinterpreted. Each rare moment of attention is magnified, and each moment of neglect is minimized. This selective seeing is not awareness. It is self-deception born from fear of letting go. The Buddha taught that ignorance is not a lack of intelligence, but a refusal to see clearly. When you stay unchosen, ignorance grows not because the truth is hidden, but because the mind turns away from it. Reality does not shout. It speaks softly through patterns, consistency, and repeated absence. Wisdom listens to these signals, but attachment covers the ears. Over time, this distorted perception reshapes the inner world. You begin to doubt your own intuition, questioning feelings that once guided you naturally. The inner compass that points toward balance and dignity starts to spin without direction. In Buddhist philosophy, this loss of inner guidance is one of the most subtle forms of suffering because it separates you from your own wisdom. Clarity returns only when the mind becomes honest with itself. When you stop negotiating with reality, when you allow what is happening to be exactly what it is, the fog begins to lift. The Buddha taught that seeing clearly is liberation itself. The moment you recognize that you are not chosen and no longer resist this truth, suffering loosens and understanding quietly takes its place. You lose harmony with impermanence and create suffering. When you stay where you are not chosen, the deepest loss is not emotional comfort or clarity of perception, but harmony with the fundamental truth the Buddha emphasized above all others: impermanence. Everything that arises is destined to change, and peace exists only when the mind moves in alignment with this reality rather than resisting it. At first, resistance is subtle. The mind quietly hopes that what has changed will somehow return to its previous form. It clings to memories of warmth, connection, and closeness, as if they were promises rather than moments. In Buddhist philosophy, memory is not the enemy, but attachment to memory transforms it into a chain. When you stay unchosen, the mind wraps itself around the past and demands that it continue into the present, even though life has already moved on. As this resistance continues, the heart begins to fight the natural flow of change. Instead of allowing relationships to evolve or end with dignity, you hold them in place through effort, patience, and self-sacrifice. Yet the Buddha taught that what requires force to remain is already departing. When effort replaces mutual presence, impermanence is no longer respected, and suffering is born. The refusal to accept change slowly distorts the sense of time. The present moment becomes overshadowed by what once was and what might be again. You begin to live between two illusions, neither of which exist now. In Buddhism, this state is known as bondage to becoming, the endless reaching toward a future that denies the truth of the present. The mind caught here cannot rest, because it is always leaning forward. Over time, this struggle against impermanence weakens the heart. There is a quiet exhaustion that comes from holding something that is already slipping away. The body feels it as tension, the mind experiences it as restlessness, and the spirit knows it as disharmony. The Buddha taught that peace is not found by preventing change, but by flowing with it without resistance. When acceptance finally arises, it does not arrive as defeat. It arrives as understanding. You begin to see that release is not abandonment, but alignment. The moment you allow what has changed to remain changed, you step back into harmony with life itself. Impermanence stops feeling like loss and begins to feel like liberation. In that understanding, suffering loosens its grip, and the mind returns to balance. You'll lose your true nature by clinging to a false self. When you remain where you are not chosen, the suffering deepens beyond emotion and perception and begins to touch the very sense of who you believe yourself to be. In Buddhist philosophy, this is the most subtle and dangerous loss because it does not feel like pain at first. It feels like adaptation. The mind slowly reshapes itself in order to remain acceptable, hoping that by becoming something else, it will finally be chosen. At first, the changes appear harmless. You speak more carefully, suppress certain feelings, soften your needs, and silence your truth. You tell yourself this is patience or understanding, but the Buddha taught that when awareness is sacrificed to maintain attachment, wisdom is already fading. The self you present becomes a version designed to be tolerated rather than authentically expressed. As this pattern continues, the illusion of a fixed self grows stronger. You begin to define your worth, through response, attention, and acceptance from another. This is where the Buddhist teaching of non-self becomes vital. The Buddha taught that suffering arises when we cling to an identity that needs constant confirmation. When you stay unchosen, the mind creates a fragile self-image that must be protected, adjusted, and repaired again and again. Over time, this false self becomes exhausting to maintain. The natural ease of being disappears, replaced by constant monitoring of behavior and emotion. You no longer move through life with simplicity. You perform. In Buddhist terms, this is called becoming. The endless effort to sustain an identity that was never real to begin with. The more effort required to be seen, the further you drift from your true nature. This distortion also weakens self-trust. You begin to doubt your natural responses, questioning whether your feelings are valid or excessive. The inner voice that once spoke with clarity becomes quiet, while the voice of fear grows louder. The Buddha taught that wisdom arises from deep listening to one's own experience. But when you remain unchosen, you stop listening inward and start adjusting outward. Release restores what attachment hides. When you stop clinging to a place where you are not chosen, the false self no longer needs to exist. There is nothing left to prove, no image to protect, and no role to maintain. In that release, the mind relaxes back into its natural state, simple, open, and unburdened. This return is not a transformation into something new, but a remembering of what was always there before attachment obscured it. You lose compassion for yourself and call it patience. When you stay where you are not chosen for too long, something very subtle and very serious begins to happen. You do not just lose clarity, peace, or identity. You slowly lose compassion for yourself. And this loss is often disguised as virtue. You tell yourself you are being patient, understanding, tolerant, or selfless. But in Buddhist wisdom, compassion that excludes oneself is incomplete and quietly destructive. At first, the heart offers kindness freely. You excuse distance, forgive neglect, and explain away absence because you believe this is what love and understanding require. Yet the Buddha taught that true compassion must be balanced with wisdom. Without wisdom, compassion becomes attachment, and attachment inevitably leads to suffering. When you remain unchosen, kindness slowly turns into endurance, and endurance slowly turns into self-neglect. As time passes, you begin to accept what once would have felt unacceptable. You lower your expectations, silence your needs, and dismiss your pain before it fully forms. The mind tells you this is maturity, but the body knows otherwise. There is a quiet tightening in the chest, a heaviness in the breath, a sense of shrinking inward. Buddhism teaches that the body is never deceived, even when the mind rationalizes. This is how self-abandonment begins, not through dramatic rejection, but through repeated moments of choosing others over your own well-being. Each time you stay silent when something hurts, you teach the mind that your suffering is less important than preserving attachment. Over time, this teaching becomes belief, and belief becomes identity. You begin to see your pain as something to tolerate rather than something to understand. The Buddha spoke often about the middle way, the path between indulgence and denial. Staying where you are not chosen pulls you away from this balance. You deny your own experience while indulging the hope that things might change. This imbalance drains the heart. Compassion turns outward endlessly, while inwardly there is emptiness and fatigue. The well runs dry because it is never replenished. Eventually, the heart grows tired of being generous without receiving presents in return. Yet instead of listening to this exhaustion, the mind often responds with guilt. You blame yourself for feeling hurt, telling yourself you should be more detached, more accepting, more spiritual. But Buddhism does not teach the suppression of pain. It teaches awareness of pain as the doorway to liberation. Self-compassion returns the moment you stop forcing yourself to remain where suffering continues. When you acknowledge your pain without judgment and allow yourself to step away from what harms your peace, kindness becomes whole again. In that wholeness, the heart softens, not because circumstances improved, but because you finally included yourself in your compassion. This inclusion is not selfishness. It is wisdom remembering itself. You lose freedom by turning attachment into a prison. When you remain where you are not chosen, the final and most painful loss is freedom. This loss does not arrive suddenly, nor does it announce itself loudly. It arrives quietly, disguised as loyalty, hope, and endurance. In Buddhist philosophy, freedom is not the ability to do whatever one wants, but the ability to remain inwardly unbound by craving, fear, and attachment. When you stay unchosen, this inner freedom slowly dissolves. At first, attachment feels gentle. It feels like caring deeply, like staying present, like not giving up too easily. The mind tells itself that holding on is a sign of strength. Yet the Buddha taught that attachment is not love. It is fear of loss. The moment fear enters the heart, freedom begins to narrow. Choices are no longer made from clarity, but from anxiety about what might disappear. As attachment deepens, the mind begins to organize itself around the object of clinging. Thoughts revolve endlessly around what was said, what was not said, what might happen, and what should have happened. This constant mental movement creates restlessness, and restlessness is the opposite of freedom. In Buddhist understanding, a free mind is a still mind, not because it is forced into silence, but because it has nothing to grasp. Over time, attachment begins to dictate behavior. You hesitate to speak honestly because honesty might disturb the fragile connection. You hesitate to step away because stepping away might make the loss permanent. The mind becomes trapped in calculation, always weighing consequences, always negotiating with fear. This is how attachment becomes a prison, not through external force, but through internal obedience. The Buddha described this state as bondage to craving. Craving does not only desire what is pleasant, it also fears the absence of what once was. When you stay where you are not chosen, craving keeps the heart tied to an image of connection rather than the reality of presence. Freedom fades because the mind no longer responds to what is, but reacts to what it fears losing. As this bondage continues, the sense of self becomes smaller. Your world narrows to a single focus, and life outside that focus feels distant and unreal. Joy becomes conditional. Peace becomes delayed. Happiness is postponed until something changes. In Buddhist philosophy, this postponement is one of the deepest forms of suffering because it places life itself always in the future, never here. The body begins to carry the weight of this captivity. Breath becomes shallow during moments of uncertainty. The chest tightens during silence. Sleep becomes restless because the mind refuses to release control even at night. Buddhism teaches that suffering is not only mental, it is embodied. The body reveals the truth, long before the mind is willing to accept it. Eventually, attachment begins to replace trust. Instead of trusting the natural flow of life, you try to manage outcomes. You watch closely, interpret signs, and attempt to predict emotional weather. This vigilance feels necessary, but it is exhausting. A mind that must constantly guard attachment cannot rest. Freedom, which requires openness and ease, becomes impossible under constant surveillance. The Buddha taught that liberation arises not through gaining control, but through relinquishing it. When you release attachment, you do not lose connection. You lose the chains that bind the heart. Yet fear resists this truth. Fear whispers that letting go means emptiness, loneliness, or failure. Buddhism teaches that this fear is itself an illusion, born from misunderstanding the nature of freedom. Freedom does not mean pushing people away. It means allowing them to be exactly as they are without tying your peace to their choices. When you stay where you are not chosen, you surrender your freedom to another's behavior. Your emotional state rises and falls according to external conditions. This dependence is the very definition of bondage in Buddhist thought. As long as freedom is conditional, suffering continues. You wait for messages, gestures, attention, or change to grant you peace. But peace that depends on conditions is never peace. The Buddha taught that true peace is unconditioned. It does not arrive when something happens. It is present when craving ends. The moment you recognize that staying unchosen is a form of self-imprisonment, a shift begins. Not a dramatic escape, but a quiet awakening. You begin to see that nothing is holding you except habit and fear. This recognition is the first crack in the prison wall. Letting go does not happen all at once. It happens through repeated moments of awareness. Each time you notice the urge to cling and choose not to act on it, the chains loosen. Each time you allow discomfort without rushing to fix it, freedom grows. Buddhism teaches that liberation is practiced, not achieved. As attachment weakens, the mind begins to open again, thoughts slow. Breath deepens, the body softens. You start to feel space around your experience rather than pressure. This space is freedom. It is not dependent on outcomes, and it does not require approval. It exists simply because you stopped gripping what caused suffering. In this freedom, love changes form. It becomes less demanding and more spacious. You can care without clinging, appreciate without possessing, and remember without longing. This is the love the Buddha pointed toward, a love that does not bind but liberates. When you finally step away from staying unchosen, you do not walk into loss, you walk back into yourself. The energy once consumed by fear returns as clarity. The attention once trapped in monitoring others returns as presence. Freedom, which seemed distant, is revealed as something you never lost, only forgot. And in that remembering, the heart rests again. You return to freedom when you stop clinging to be chosen. When you finally release the need to remain where you are not chosen, something profound happens that most people never experience clearly. You do not become stronger in the way the world defines strength, nor harder, nor detached in a cold sense. Instead, you return to a natural state that was always present beneath the layers of attachment, fear, and longing. In Buddhist philosophy, this return is not an achievement, it is a remembering. The Buddha taught that suffering ends not when circumstances improve, but when craving dissolves. Craving to be chosen, to be seen, to be validated, is one of the most subtle cravings of all, because it disguises itself as love. Yet love that requires self-erasure is not love. It is bondage. When you stop clinging to being chosen, you step out of this bondage and into clarity. At first, this release may feel unfamiliar. The mind, long accustomed to leaning outward, does not know where to rest. There may be moments of emptiness, silence, or uncertainty. Buddhism does not deny this phase. It recognizes it as the space that appears when old attachments loosen, but new understanding has not yet fully settled. This space is not a mistake. It is the doorway. In this openness, the mind begins to slow. Thoughts that once circled endlessly around another person start to lose their urgency. The stories that justified staying begin to fade. What remains is awareness, simple and direct. Awareness does not argue with reality. It sees clearly and remains still. This stillness is not numbness. It is peace unburdened by expectation. As awareness deepens, you begin to notice how much energy was once consumed by seeking, waiting, hoping, and interpreting. This energy now returns to you. You feel it as presence, as breath, moving freely, as attention no longer fragmented. The Buddha taught that when the mind is no longer divided, it becomes whole. Wholeness does not depend on another's choice. It arises naturally when grasping ends. In this state, the illusion of needing to be chosen dissolves. You see that worth was never something another could grant or withhold. Worth was never absent. It was only obscured by the belief that it required confirmation. Buddhist wisdom reminds us that the self we try to protect and validate is itself a construction. When that construction loosens, suffering loosens with it. Letting go also transforms how you relate to others. You no longer approach relationships from hunger or fear. You no longer shrink to fit or perform, to be accepted. Instead, you meet others from fullness. From this place, connection becomes a meeting rather than a pursuit. Presence replaces persuasion. Honesty replaces strategy. The Buddha spoke of non-attachment, not as withdrawal from life, but as freedom within it. When you are no longer attached to being chosen, you can appreciate people without trying to possess their attention. You can enjoy moments without demanding permanence. You can allow others to come and go without collapsing inward. This is not indifference, it is maturity of the heart. As this freedom stabilizes, something else becomes clear. You realize that staying where you were not chosen was never about the other person alone. It was about the mind's resistance to uncertainty and loss. By releasing that resistance, you make peace with impermanence itself. You no longer see endings as failures, but as natural movements within life's flow. In Buddhist understanding, liberation is not the absence of pain, but the absence of struggle against pain. When you stop struggling to be chosen, pain loses its power to define you. It may arise briefly, but it no longer rules the mind. You feel emotions without becoming trapped inside them. You experience sadness without drowning in it. This balance is wisdom embodied. Gradually, trust returns. Not trust in outcomes, but trust in life as it unfolds. You begin to trust that what leaves does so for a reason aligned with your awakening, even if the mind cannot immediately explain it. The Buddha did not ask us to understand everything. He asked us to observe without clinging. In this observation, peace grows naturally. From this place of trust, you no longer chase connection, you allow it. You do not demand presence, you welcome it. And if it does not come, you remain whole. This wholeness is the end of suffering, as described in Buddhist teaching. Not because the world became perfect, but because the mind stopped demanding that it be so. Eventually, the memory of staying unchosen loses its emotional charge. It becomes a lesson rather than a wound. You can look back without bitterness, without regret, without longing. You see clearly that what once felt like loss was in fact guidance. It showed you where attachment lived, and in showing you, it pointed the way to freedom. This is the quiet victory Buddhism speaks of. Not triumph over others, but liberation from illusion. Not gaining something new, but releasing what was heavy. The heart becomes light again. Not because life is easy, but because it is no longer resisted. When you stop clinging to being chosen, you step fully into the present moment. And in the present moment, there is nothing missing. There is breath. There is awareness. There is peace that does not depend on permission. This is the end of the path of suffering and the beginning of the path of freedom. You were never meant to beg for presence or prove your worth through endurance. What you have just seen is not a lesson about others, but a reminder of your own freedom. The Buddha did not teach us to cling tighter when something causes pain. He taught us to observe, to understand, and then to release. When you let go of those who do not choose you, you are not rejecting them. You are ending the habit of suffering. Nothing that is truly meant for you will require you to abandon your peace. Nothing that belongs in your life will ask you to live in constant waiting. Sit with this truth gently. Allow it to settle without force. Let it soften the grip of attachment in your heart. Freedom does not arrive as noise or celebration. It arrives quietly, the moment you stop holding what was never meant to stay. If this teaching spoke to you, carry it into your daily awareness. Each time attachment arises, return to the breath. Each time suffering appears, look for what you are holding. Release does not make you empty, it makes you light. And in that lightness, peace becomes your natural state once again.